The president of the St. Louis Fed, James Bullard, just recently said on national TV that the Federal Reserve's credibility is on the line with how it responds to inflation. He's calling for a much more aggressive approach from the Federal Reserve to combat inflation, especially given the fact that inflation has been both higher and more persistent than the Federal Reserve expected. Despite this, what we are going to talk about in this video is number one, why the Federal Reserve will not get as aggressive as they need to be to fight inflation, and number two, why it doesn't matter. Because whether the Fed puts all of their resources to fight inflation or all of their resources to fight deflation, the deleveraging is coming either way. There is no soft landing for the Fed. Ready? Let's dive in. Inflation hit 7.5% year over year in January, and that sparked rumors, and the market started pricing in higher and higher likelihoods of more rate hikes by the Federal Reserve. At this point, the market is currently pricing in 6 to 7 rate hikes this year at 0.25% each. Bullard is saying that by July, the Federal Reserve should be at least 100 basis points higher. For those of you who aren't aware, a basis point is 1% of 1%. And so if you talk about 1%, that's 100 basis points. Typically, the Federal Reserve will raise rates by 25 basis points, 0.25% at a time. There were rumors that the Federal Reserve might engage in an emergency rate hike in between their meetings. They rarely, I don't know if they've actually ever done that. The only times that they make changes to interest rates on an emergency basis in between meetings is when they're dropping rates basically to zero to respond to something like March of 2020. So despite the fact that Bullard is actually voting this year, it is not going to matter. The Federal Reserve will not attack inflation as aggressively as they need to in order to actually stop it. This is because they fear deflation far more than they fear inflation. So while they do want to stop inflation being up at 7.5%, they do not want it to go under 2%. I've said it before, I'll say it a million more times. 2% is not stable prices. The Federal Reserve has a mandate given to them by Congress to have stable prices, to seek stable prices. Stable, I thought, meant stable. I didn't think stable meant rising consistently every single year. But the Federal Reserve has interpreted the word stable as 2%. The reason for this is because they need inflation. When you have a system that is built on debt, if you do not continually have a degrading of the purchasing power of the units of currency, the debt gets more expensive, more costly, harder to pay back over time, not easier. Because when you have inflation, it benefits the borrowers at the expense of the lenders. When you have a system that does not make that happen, that has deflation, let's say the money supply never changes, things get cheaper over time, prices slowly drop, that benefits the lenders at the expense of the borrowers. That would be fine if you were starting from zero, if you were starting over, blank slate, and there was nothing going on right now. There were no people borrowing money. There were no people that had a bunch of debt already. And you were saying, we're starting over with this new system. Then fine, that's a better system. But even if they acknowledge that, and even if they think that that's true, there is no way they would want to risk tipping over into that because the entire system is built on history's largest pile of debt. Households are the most over-leveraged they've ever been when you consider both mortgage debt and non-mortgage debt. Over-leveraged, biggest pile of debt in history. Corporations, biggest pile of debt in history. Governments, biggest pile of debt in history. Guess where interest rates are? Lowest interest rates in history. So there's a floor here. There's a limit to the amount that we can make that debt easier to pay off by lowering interest rates. That means that there's a very real possibility that debt starts to get harder and harder and harder to pay off. And if you're not careful, if you fight inflation too aggressively, you tip over into a deflationary debt spiral where you have defaults and bankruptcies and all that debt starts to get wiped out. You have the deleveraging happen on the deflationary side, where you have defaults and all of the lenders get wiped out. Now, let me ask you this. Who is in power? Who's in control? Well, there are a couple answers. You can make up your mind about who it is. Let's start off with option number one. Let's say it's the government, the politicians. Who is the most over-leveraged entity in history right now? The United States government. They've got more debt than they've ever had from a raw dollar perspective. The debt to GDP is the highest that it's ever been. We're sitting at about 120% debt to GDP ratio right now. When you consider the debt service cost as a percentage of the federal government's total income that it's bringing in from taxes, it is at an all-time high. So no matter how you look at it, the federal government is the most over-leveraged and stands the most to lose if they default and can't pay that debt. Now let's say they're just the front, they're just the face, they're not the ones pulling the strings. Let's say it's the large corporations. Let's say it's the bankers, the central bankers. That's fine. Who's the most over-leveraged outside of the government? Corporations. Again, debt all-time high, interest rates all-time low. Now let's say you're a believer in the way that the system works and you say, no, that's not who's pulling the strings. Ultimately, it's the voter, it's democracy, it's freedom, it's all the individuals around the world. Guess who's the most over-leveraged outside of governments and corporations? Households, voters. You really think that the people who are in power are going to risk it all by tipping the system over, collapsing it into a system that might be better moving forward, although they probably don't believe that, when they're risking putting all of that financial pain on every single voter, on every single customer, on every single person that in reality, if they believed it, has the power to make the changes? Absolutely not. No matter how you look at it, the system incentives are designed to favor inflation over deflation. And so no matter how hard they say they're going to fight inflation, they'll never fight it hard enough to tip over into deflation. And this is where we get to the second point, that either way it doesn't matter because the deleveraging is coming no matter what. The purchasing power has already been spent. There is no free lunch with purchasing power. Short-term purchasing power is a zero-sum game. I'll give you a great example that many other people have used that explains this very easily. If you want to measure a house, you take out your tape measure and you pull it out, you measure it from top to bottom, and you get 12 feet. Now let's say you want that house to be bigger. One option is to actually build it bigger and have real growth. And then you measure it and let's say it's 15 feet because the total size of the house actually grew. But that takes time and that takes resources, and that is a real growth of the wealth of that house. The other option is you could take out a marker and you could change how big a foot is on your measuring tape. And instead of it being 12 inches for a foot, it's only 6 inches now. Now when you measure the house, it's double the size as it was before. It's 24 feet instead of 12 feet. Now, did the size of the house actually change? Absolutely not. Of course not. The way you measured it changed. Now let's say you want to increase the purchasing power of an economy on the back of savings and real investment and real growth and technological progress and advancement in efficiency and progress over time. You get a growth of real wealth. That does increase purchasing power over time because the amount of stuff in the system grows faster than the amount of money in the system, which is how you measure the size of the wealth pool. However, the other option is to double the supply of money. Now, the supply of money is how you measure all the wealth. And so if you double the supply of money, it's going to look like the total wealth in the system increased, right? Everybody's going to look at their own bank accounts and they're going to say, I'm twice as rich as I was before. But what happens if all of that money goes out to get spent? Is there enough stuff to support the spending of all that increased purchasing power? Of course not. So you have two options. Either some of it gets spent, you buy up all the stuff, and then you have half the money left over, but no stuff. That doesn't work. So the other way that it works out is that all the prices adjust upwards. And so if you double the supply of money and then double the prices, well, then all that money can be spent. But guess what? You doubled the price of everything, so you were able to purchase the same amount as you were able to purchase before, even though it cost double the amount of money. So the purchasing power didn't change. There's no free lunch. And it works the same way with leverage. When you spend money that is borrowed, the only way that that can happen is by taking purchasing power from the future and bringing it forward into the present. Debt means that purchasing power has already been spent. There's no way around that. There is no soft landing. There's no economic policy. There is no inflationary policy or deflationary policy that can change the fact that anytime you increase leverage, you are taking purchasing power from the future and bringing it forward into the present. And once it's spent, it's gone. And anything that levers up will eventually deleverage one way or the other. And there are two ways that a deleveraging can happen, which is inflation or deflation. And back to what I was saying before, when the incentives in the system are designed to be terrified of a deflationary deleveraging, and the ones in control benefit from an inflationary deleveraging, where the deleveraging still happens, but you have to choose who bears the cost of the deleveraging? The borrower or the lender? The ones who are in control will choose the option that benefits themselves. In this case, it's the borrowers, which is why it does not matter if we have a few people that are being verbal about how much more the Federal Reserve needs to attack inflation. Number one, they don't have the guts or the knowledge necessary to say, yes, it would actually be better to fight inflation to the full extent and to stop it in its tracks. Number two, the entire system is built on so much leverage that no matter what happens, no matter what they do, the deleveraging is coming either way. And when you look at the incentive structure, you can take a good guess at which side they're going to choose, because there's no soft landing. The deleveraging is coming. Are we going to deleverage into deflation or deleverage into inflation? You know which one I'm picking. Finally, I will be in Dallas on March 5th for an event. The VIP tickets are sold out, but the general admission tickets are still available right now. I would love to see you there. If you can join, sign up link is in the description below. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.